Hello, dear learners. Today we're going to explore something deeply human, something we all experience but often struggle to express. We're going to talk about sadness, not the kind that comes and goes quickly, but the quiet, heavy sadness that settles into our hearts and stays for a while. But here's what makes this story different. It's not just about falling into darkness. It's about the journey back to light. It's about discovering that even when we feel completely broken, there's a strength inside us we didn't know we had. In today's story, you'll experience the world through observation, through feeling, through the small details that tell us someone is hurting and then healing. This is how we learn to show emotions in English, not just tell them. As you listen, pay attention to the verbs, the adjectives, the expressions we use to paint a picture of sadness transforming into hope. Notice how English can capture both the weight of despair and the lightness of recovery in carefully chosen words. Remember, every story of sadness is also a story of survival, and this one is yours as much as it is hers. Are you ready? Let's begin. She was 32 years old, though age hardly mattered anymore in the fog she was living through. Her dark hair, once worn in a neat bun, now hung loosely around her shoulders, not from carelessness, but from exhaustion. She simply didn't have the energy to care about appearances. Her eyes, once bright and curious, had become distant, like windows to an empty room where someone used to live. She worked as a librarian in a small neighborhood library, surrounded by thousands of stories. Ironically, while she spent her days helping others find stories of adventure, romance, and triumph, she felt trapped in a narrative with no happy ending. She had always loved books, loved the smell of old pages, loved the quiet sanctuary that libraries provided. But lately, even the things she loved felt hollow, as if she were going through the motions of a life that no longer fit her. Her home was a second-floor apartment with pale blue walls and wooden floors that creaked when she walked. There were plants on the windowsill, succulents that required little care because she barely had the energy to care for herself, let alone anything else. Those small, resilient plants would become important later, though she didn't know it yet. They were surviving on minimal water and attention, just like her. People who passed her on the street would see an ordinary woman. They wouldn't notice the way her shoulders curved slightly inward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller, trying to take up less space in a world that felt too overwhelming. They wouldn't see how her smile, when it appeared, never quite reached her eyes, like a light switch that had been turned on but wasn't connected to any power source. But this external invisibility of her pain was about to become the very thing that would force her to confront it. Because you can't heal what you keep hidden, even from yourself. The city was entering autumn when our story begins, and this seasonal transition mirrored the transition happening inside her. The leaves were turning golden and crimson, falling in slow spirals to the pavement below. Most people found this season beautiful, romantic, even a time of cozy sweaters and warm drinks. But for her, autumn felt like the world was dying in slow motion, nature itself demonstrating that all beautiful things eventually fade and fall. Yet autumn, as she would later discover, isn't just about endings. It's also about preparation for renewal. The trees weren't dying, they were wisely letting go of what they couldn't carry through the winter, trusting that spring would come again. She didn't understand this wisdom yet, but she would. Her apartment building sat on a tree-lined street in an older part of the city. The neighborhood was quiet, residential, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors' faces but rarely knew their names, rarely knew their struggles. In the mornings, she could hear the muffled sounds of life around her. Footsteps on the stairs, a radio playing somewhere, children laughing as they waited for the school bus. These sounds both comforted and tormented her. They reminded her that life continued, that the world kept spinning, indifferent to individual pain. The library where she worked was a 15-minute walk from her apartment. This daily walk would eventually become a crucial part of her healing, though she couldn't imagine that now. The library itself was a small brick building with tall windows and a green door that needed repainting. Inside, it smelled like paper, old wood, and floor polish. Sunlight streamed through the windows in thick beams, illuminating dust particles floating in the air, each tiny speck drifting aimlessly, suspended, going nowhere. She felt exactly like those particles. Every day followed the same pattern, the same monotonous rhythm. She would wake up at 7, though she often lay in bed until 7:30, staring at the ceiling, building up the courage to face another day. She would make coffee but barely drink it. She would walk to work, check in books, help patrons find what they needed, shelf returns, and walk home again as the sun began to set. Then she would sit in her apartment as darkness filled the windows, matching the darkness inside her. The world continued around her, seasons changing, people rushing, life happening, but she felt separate from it all, like she was watching everything through thick glass. She was in the world but not of it, present but not participating, breathing but not living. This disconnection from life was the setting of her sadness. But every stage is set for a reason, and every scene must eventually change. To understand where she was going, we must understand where she had been. 3 months ago, her younger brother had died in a car accident. He had been 28 years old, vibrant, optimistic, always making plans for the future, always believing in tomorrow. He was studying to become a teacher because he wanted to inspire young people. He wanted to travel to Japan. He called her every Sunday evening without fail, and those calls had been the rhythm of her weeks, the heartbeat of her routine. And then, one rainy Tuesday, he was gone, just like that. A moment of inattention, a wet road, and everything changed forever. The Sunday calls stopped. The future he had planned evaporated. The person she loved most in the world disappeared in an instant, leaving only an absence so profound it felt like a physical presence. This loss connected directly to her current state. She had gone through the motions after his death because that's what everyone expected. She had attended the funeral, accepted condolences from relatives she barely knew, helped her parents sort through his belongings, each item a small knife cutting her heart. People kept telling her that time heals all wounds and that she needed to stay strong. They meant well, but their words felt empty, like trying to fill an ocean with a teaspoon. Now, 3 months later, everyone expected her to be better, and this expectation had become its own prison. Her boss asked if she was feeling more like herself. Her friends invited her out, growing frustrated when she declined. Her mother called every few days, her voice tight with worry, asking if she was okay. But she wasn't okay. She was drowning in a grief that had no bottom, no edges, no end in sight. And worse, much worse, she felt guilty for still being sad. She felt like she was failing at recovery, failing at moving on, failing at being the strong person everyone expected her to be. This guilt, layered on top of grief, created a weight so heavy she could barely move. The problem wasn't just that her brother was gone, though that alone was unbearable. The problem was that she had lost her ability to feel anything except the absence of him. Joy felt impossible. Hope felt like a cruel joke. Even the simplest tasks, getting dressed, eating breakfast, responding to a text message, felt like climbing a mountain with weights tied to her ankles. She was stuck, paralyzed between the person she used to be and a future she couldn't imagine. And that's where our real journey begins, because sometimes you have to reach the very bottom before you can start climbing back up. Week 1, the numbness, when feeling nothing feels like everything. The days blurred together in those early weeks, each one indistinguishable from the last. She went to work because she had to, because bills needed to be paid and routines needed to be maintained. But she moved through her life like a ghost, present but not really there, occupying space but not inhabiting it. At the library, she performed her duties mechanically, like a robot programmed for basic functions. She scanned books without seeing their titles. She answered questions with brief responses, her voice flat and emotionless. She avoided eye contact because eyes were windows and she couldn't let anyone see the emptiness inside. During her lunch break, she would sit in the break room, staring at a sandwich she couldn't bring herself to eat, watching the clock tick away minutes that felt meaningless. Her colleagues noticed but didn't know what to say. They would glance at her with concern, then look away quickly, as if grief were contagious, as if acknowledging it might somehow infect them too. But this numbness, though it felt like nothingness, was actually something. It was her mind's way of protecting her from overwhelming pain. Like a circuit breaker that shuts off power to prevent a fire, her emotions had temporarily shut down to prevent her from being completely destroyed. She didn't understand this protection at the time. She only felt empty. In the evenings, she would return to her apartment and sink onto the couch. That word sink perfectly describing the heavy downward pull of her exhaustion. She would turn on the television without really watching it. The voices and flickering images filled the silence, but not the emptiness. Sometimes she would cry, not dramatic sobs, just tears sliding down her cheeks while she stared blankly ahead. Tears that felt more like leaking than crying, as if sadness were simply seeping out of her. This numbness couldn't last forever. Nothing does. And what came next would be harder, but ultimately more helpful. Because you can't heal from nothing, you can only heal from something. And she was about to feel something very intensely indeed. Week 2, the anger fire breaking through ice. One morning, she woke up feeling different. The numbness had cracked like ice on a frozen pond, and underneath it was anger, hot, fierce, and consuming. It roared through her like wildfire, and though it was terrifying, it was also the first real feeling she'd had in weeks. She was angry at the driver who had caused the accident, angry at the universe for being so random and cruel, angry at everyone who told her to be strong or that her brother was in a better place. She was angry at her brother himself for leaving, even though she knew that made no sense, even though she knew it wasn't his fault. This anger, though frightening, was actually progress. It meant she was beginning to process her grief, beginning to push back against the unfairness of it all. Numbness is passive, anger is active, and action, even uncomfortable action, moves us forward. At work, a patron complained about a late fee, just $2, and she felt a surge of rage so intense that she had to excuse herself and hide in the storage room. She stood among the dusty boxes of old books, hands shaking, breathing hard, her whole body vibrating with fury. How dare the world continue as if nothing had happened? How dare people care about late fees and weather forecasts and what to have for dinner when her brother was dead? How dare the sun keep rising? How dare life keep demanding participation? That evening, she finally called her mother back after ignoring her calls for days. Her mother asked gentle questions. Was she eating properly? Was she sleeping? Had she considered seeing a therapist? And instead of the numbness or polite deflection, she felt her anger flare. She snapped at her mother, harsh words she instantly regretted, and hung up. Then she sat on her kitchen floor and cried until her throat hurt, the anger transforming into something softer but no less painful. The anger phase was necessary because it meant she was fighting, even if she was fighting against everything. But anger alone couldn't sustain her. It would exhaust itself eventually, leading to the next stage of her descent and her eventual ascent. As the anger faded, replaced by exhaustion, she entered a new phase, complete isolation. She stopped answering her phone. She stopped checking messages. When friends knocked on her door, she pretended she wasn't home, holding her breath until she heard their footsteps retreat down the stairs. The isolation felt both terrible and necessary. She couldn't bear to be around people who expected her to heal, to smile, to participate in life. Their expectations felt like pressure she couldn't withstand. But being alone meant confronting the full weight of her sadness with no distractions, no buffer, no escape. She began having trouble sleeping, which made everything worse. She would lie awake for hours, memories playing on an endless loop. She remembered his laugh, loud and infectious. She remembered the way he would tease her affectionately. She remembered the last conversation they'd had about nothing important and how she'd been distracted, half listening. This led to the torment of what-ifs, those cruel questions that have no answers. What if he had left 5 minutes earlier that day? What if he'd taken a different route? What if she had insisted he stay for dinner instead of driving home? What if she had paid more attention during that last call? What if she had said, "I love you" one more time? These questions were quicksand, pulling her deeper with every thought. And yet, this too was part of the process. She was searching for control in a situation that had been completely beyond her control. She was trying to rewrite a story that had already been written. During this isolation phase, she was building a cocoon around herself, not to stay in forever, but to undergo the transformation that only happens in darkness. She didn't know that yet. She only knew she couldn't face the world, couldn't pretend, couldn't perform normalcy anymore. But isolation has limits. Eventually, the cocoon would crack, not from external pressure, but from the growth happening inside it. And that breaking open, though painful, would be the beginning of something new. Week 4, the breaking point, when the dam finally bursts. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon at the library. An elderly man approached the circulation desk with a stack of books to return. Among them was a book about teaching methods, the kind of book her brother would have borrowed, the kind he had borrowed many times while studying to become a teacher. Her hands began to tremble as she scanned it. The trembling spread through her whole body like an earthquake, starting in her core and radiating outward. Her vision blurred. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The walls seemed to close in around her. The sounds of the library became overwhelming, too loud, too bright, too much. She was having a panic attack, her body finally rebelling against the weight of unexpressed grief. Her supervisor noticed and quickly guided her to the back office. She collapsed into a chair, unable to control her breathing, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking uncontrollably. She felt like she was breaking apart, like all the grief she'd been holding in was exploding outward all at once, like a dam that had finally burst under unbearable pressure. "I can't do this," she managed to gasp between breaths. I can't. Her supervisor, a kind woman who had lost her own husband years before, knelt beside her. She didn't offer platitudes or advice or solutions. She didn't tell her to be strong or that time heals all wounds. She just stayed there, a quiet presence, breathing slowly so she could try to match that rhythm until her breathing slowly returned to normal. After that day, something fundamental shifted. She couldn't keep pretending anymore. The facade of functionality had crumbled completely, and there was no putting it back together, and more importantly, no reason to, because that facade hadn't been protecting her, it had been suffocating her. This breaking point, though it felt like falling apart, was actually the moment everything could begin to come together differently. Sometimes we have to completely break down before we can rebuild ourselves stronger. Sometimes the old version of us has to shatter so a new version can emerge. And so, from this lowest point, her real journey upward would begin. The moment of transformation. Let us pause in the quiet space between who she was and who she is becoming. Here, in this stillness, her vocabulary of emotion begins to speak for her. She has spent days sinking into the familiar weight of sorrow. At times, it felt as if she were drowning in her own grief, pulled under by memories that refused to loosen their grip. She collapsed into silence, crumbled beneath small moments, and shut down in ways no one could see. Her mind spiraled downward and inward, creating tunnels where light could not easily reach. Her inner world had grown hollow, the kind of empty that echoes when you breathe. She moved through her days numb, distant, consumed by a sadness so complete that she lived on instinct alone, mechanical, detached, barely holding herself together. But even the deepest descent carries the beginning of an ascent. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. A breath that didn't tremble. A step that didn't drag. A morning where the air didn't feel so heavy. Slowly, she began to emerge from thoughts that held her prisoner, from fear that had woven itself into her ribs. Nothing was sudden, nothing was dramatic. Healing rarely announces itself. It arrives like dawn, gradual, gentle, inevitable. With each fragile moment, she rebuilt the parts of herself she once believed were gone. Her resilience returned not as strength, but as softness. Her hope returned not as certainty, but as something tentative, small, flickering, alive. Her spirit felt renewed, like a flame rediscovering oxygen. As she walked forward, the metaphors of her journey shifted. She was no longer going through the motions. She was turning a corner. She was seeing light at the end of the tunnel. And though the weight she carried had not disappeared, she now had the strength to lift it piece by piece. Her body told the story before her words ever could. Her shoulders lifted from their defeated curve. Her eyes, once distant, began to focus again. Her smile, once hollow, began to reach the edges of her face. Her breath, once shallow and panicked, settled into a steady rhythm, like the quiet return of life after a storm. This is how transformation begins. In the smallest physical shifts, in the barely noticeable changes that whisper, "You are healing." She hadn't known the last moment of her pain had already passed. But the future was unfolding inside her, quietly preparing a new chapter she couldn't yet see. Every breaking point had taught her something. Every descent had carved space for her rise. Every dark hour had prepared the glow of what was coming. Now she stood on the threshold of something new. Not healed, not finished, but breaking through the surface at last. And as she continued forward, she carried the contrast of her journey like a map. Darkness into light, heaviness into ease, stillness into movement, isolation into connection. This was her transformation, subtle, powerful, alive. A moment not of triumph, but of awakening. A moment where she finally whispered, "I can rise." After the panic attack at work, she took a week off. And this is where our story truly transforms, where descent becomes ascent, where breaking down becomes breaking through. She spent the first 2 days in bed, staring at the wall, letting herself feel everything she'd been holding back. She didn't fight the sadness. She didn't judge herself for still hurting. She just allowed it to be there, to wash over her like waves, trusting that waves eventually recede. On the 3rd day, she did something that required enormous courage. She called the therapist, a number her mother had given her weeks ago that had been sitting on her nightstand like a lifeline she'd been too afraid to grab. The first therapy session was difficult. Sitting across from a stranger trying to put her pain into words felt impossible. How do you describe the absence of someone? How do you explain that you've lost not just a person but your entire sense of how the world works? But the therapist, who had kind eyes and a gentle presence, didn't push. She just listened. And then the therapist said something that cracked open the prison she'd been living in. grief has no timeline, and recovery isn't linear. You don't move forward in a straight line. Sometimes you take steps backward. Sometimes you stay in the same place for a long time, and that's okay. You're not failing, you're human. Those words, "that's okay," were the permission she'd been desperately needing. Permission to still be sad. Permission to not be better yet. Permission to grieve at her own pace without shame or guilt. That night, lying in bed, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing, not yet, but a loosening, like a fist that had been clenched for months was finally beginning to open. On the 5th day of her leave, she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She looked at photos of her brother. She had been avoiding them like poison, afraid of the pain they would bring. But now, gathering her courage like someone preparing to jump into cold water, she scrolled through her phone, really looking at his face. There he was at their parents' house last Christmas, wearing that ridiculous sweater their aunt had given him, the one with the reindeer that lit up. There he was at his graduation, grinning widely, his whole future ahead of him. There he was as a child, missing his 2 front teeth, that gap-toothed smile she had loved. She cried as she looked at the photos, but it was different this time. The tears felt cleansing rather than destroying, like rain washing away dust. She wasn't crying only because he was gone, she was crying because he had existed, because he had been real and funny and kind, because she had been lucky enough to know him, to be loved by him, to share years with him, even if it hadn't been for long enough. It would never have been long enough. This shift from mourning what she'd lost to honoring what she'd had was the turning point. That evening, driven by something she didn't fully understand, she walked to a nearby park and sat on a bench. It was the same park where she and her brother used to play when they were children, where he'd pushed her on the swings and taught her to climb the jungle gym. The swings were still there, rusty but standing, moving gently in the wind like they were remembering too. She sat and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, those colors that appear when day transforms into night, one beautiful thing becoming another. The air was cool against her skin, sharp and clean. Leaves crunched under people's feet as they passed by, families, couples, someone walking a dog. Life was happening all around her, painful, beautiful, relentless life. And for the first time in months, she felt something besides sadness. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It wasn't even hope. It was just presence. An awareness of being alive, of occupying space in the world, of still breathing, of her lungs filling and emptying, of her heart still beating despite everything. "I miss you so much," she whispered to the empty air, to her brother, to the universe, to the wind. "But I'm still here, and I don't know what to do with that yet, but maybe that's okay too." It wasn't resolution, it wasn't complete healing, but it was a beginning, the first small crack in the heavy shell that had formed around her heart, letting in the thinnest beam of light. And sometimes that's all we need, just one crack, just one beam of light, just one moment of realizing we're still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than pain. From that crack, everything else could grow. When she returned to work, it felt like walking into a life she'd left behind, both familiar and strange. It wasn't easy. She still had hard days when getting out of bed felt impossible, when the weight of grief pressed down on her chest like physical pressure. But she went anyway because staying home meant drowning again, and she'd decided, somewhere in that park watching the sunset, that she wanted to learn how to swim. Her colleagues welcomed her back with warm, careful smiles. Her supervisor had told them to give her space but to also let her know she wasn't alone. So they did small things, brought her coffee in the morning, left encouraging notes on her desk, asked simple questions that didn't require deep answers. These tiny acts of kindness, which might have seemed insignificant to them, were lifelines to her. They reminded her that people cared, that she was seen, that she mattered. She began seeing the therapist regularly, every Tuesday afternoon. The sessions didn't make the pain disappear, nothing could do that, but they gave her tools to carry it differently. She learned that grief wasn't something to get over, but something to integrate into her life. Her brother would always be gone, and that would always hurt. But maybe eventually she could hold both the sadness and the joy of having known him. Maybe she could carry his memory not as a burden, but as a treasure. This was a revolutionary idea, that sadness and gratitude could coexist, that she could miss him terribly while also feeling blessed to have had him at all. She started doing small things to honor his memory, to transform her grief into something meaningful. She donated to a scholarship fund for aspiring teachers, hoping to help someone else achieve the dream her brother had been building. She visited his favorite coffee shop on Sundays and ordered what he used to order, a vanilla latte with an extra shot. She talked to him sometimes, in her head or out loud when she was alone, sharing her day as if he could still hear her. And maybe in some way he could. Some days were steps forward. She laughed at something a library patron said, really laughed from her belly, and the sound surprised her. She enjoyed the taste of her morning coffee again, noticing its warmth and richness. She noticed the way sunlight caught in the leaves outside her window, making them glow like stained glass. These small moments of pleasure felt like miracles after months of numbness. Some days were steps backward. She found one of his hoodies in her closet and spent an entire evening crying into it, breathing in the fatting scent of his cologne. She saw a car that looked like his and felt the grief crash over her again like a wave, sudden and overwhelming. On those days, she reminded herself of what the therapist had said: recovery isn't linear. Backward steps are still part of moving forward. The path to healing is a spiral, not a straight line. But slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, like the way seasons change gradually until one day you realize everything has transformed. The good moments became a little more frequent. The heavy weight on her chest became a little lighter. Not gone, never gone, but bearable. She could breathe more deeply. She could sleep more soundly. She could look forward to tomorrow without dread. 3 months later, rediscovering small joys. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror one morning and realized something. She had slept through the night. It was the first time in months. Her sleep had been deep and dreamless, restful in a way she'd forgotten was possible. And when she looked at her reflection, she saw a faint spark in her eyes, not the full brightness from before, but something. A pilot light, still burning, small but steady. Evidence that something inside her refused to give up. She went for a walk that afternoon, not because she had to, not because it was part of some self-care routine someone had recommended, but because she wanted to. She actually wanted to. This desire itself was a victory. She walked through her neighborhood, noticing things she'd been blind to for months. A dog playing joyfully in a yard, chasing its tail in circles of pure happiness. An old couple holding hands as they walked slowly down the sidewalk, their lifetime of love visible in that simple gesture. Street art on the side of a building, a colorful mural of a phoenix rising from ashes, wings spread wide, ascending into flames that looked both like destruction and rebirth. She stopped and stared at that mural for a long time, rising from ashes. She wasn't there yet, wasn't fully risen, but maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand that it was possible. That people could be broken and remade. That endings could become beginnings. That ashes could become wings. That evening, she did something she hadn't done since before her brother died. She called a friend. Her friend Sarah, who had been gently texting her every few weeks without pressure or expectation, just letting her know she was there. Sarah answered on the second ring, surprised but delighted. "Oh my God, hi, how are you?" She took a breath, considering the question honestly. I'm getting there," she said, and her voice was stronger than she expected. "It's still really hard. There are still days when I can barely function. But I think I'm ready to try being in the world again, to try being myself again, or whoever I'm becoming." They made plans to meet for coffee the next weekend. It was a small step, but it mattered enormously. It meant she was opening the door she'd closed, letting connection back in, trusting herself to handle both the company of others and the inevitable questions about how she was doing. That night, she watered her succulents for the first time in weeks. They had survived her neglect, these tough little plants, and looking at them now, she felt a kinship with them. They had endured, they had adapted, they had survived with minimal resources, and now, with just a little care, they would thrive again. She would too. 6 months later, building a life that honors both loss and living. The library was hosting a reading event for children, and she had volunteered to help organize it. 6 months ago, the thought of being around joyful, energetic children would have been unbearable, a reminder of all the children her brother would never teach. But now, as she watched kids sitting cross-legged on the floor, their faces rapt with attention as a storyteller performed, she felt something unexpected: gratitude. Not gratitude that her brother had died, that would never make sense and she would never be grateful for that loss. But gratitude that she had known him, that he had shaped her life in countless ways, that his kindness, his humor, his belief in the power of education, his love, all of that had been real, and she carried those things with her. They weren't gone, they were woven into who she was. She thought about something her therapist had said recently: grief is love with nowhere to go, but maybe eventually you can find new places for that love to flow. She was beginning to understand what that meant. The love she had for her brother didn't disappear with him. It was still there, enormous and aching, a force that needed expression. But it didn't have to only cause pain. She could let it flow into memories, into honoring him, into living a life that would have made him proud. She could let it flow into kindness toward others, into supporting causes he cared about, into being the kind of person he had believed she could be. She still cried. Of course she still cried. She still had days when sadness wrapped around her like a fog, when grief rose up unexpectedly, triggered by a song, a smell, a random memory that appeared without warning. But she also had days when she felt okay, days when she felt almost good, days when she laughed freely, days when she could imagine a future that included both her grief and her healing, both the scar and the growth around it. One evening, she wrote a letter to her brother. She told him about her journey through these terrible months. She told him about the panic attack, the therapy, the slow rebuilding. She told him about the Phoenix mural. She told him she was trying to live well, not because she was over losing him, but because he would have wanted her to live well. She told him she loved him and missed him, and that he would always be part of her story. She didn't mail the letter, there was nowhere to send it, but writing it felt like completion, like a ritual, like transformation made tangible. Sadness, she was learning, didn't have to be overcome or defeated like an enemy. It could be carried like a companion. It could be transformed like raw material shaped into something meaningful. It could coexist with hope and joy and purpose. She could be both sad and okay, both grieving and growing, both wounded and healing. And perhaps most importantly, she learned that healing isn't about going back to who you were before. You can't. That person existed in a different time, in a world that included someone who's now gone. Healing is about becoming someone new, someone who has survived loss and been changed by it, but not destroyed by it. Someone who carries both the wound and the wisdom that comes from it. As autumn arrived again, a full year since this journey began, she visited that park bench once more. The same leaves were falling in the same slow spirals, but she was different. She sat there and spoke too. And so our story comes to a close, not with a fairy tale ending where everything is perfect, because that wouldn't be honest, but with something more valuable: continuation. Her journey goes on. Some days will be harder than others. Some days will surprise her with unexpected joy. But she has learned the most important truth: she can carry both. She can hold grief in one hand and hope in the other. This story was about sadness, yes, but it was also about something more powerful: resilience. About the slow, unglamorous, deeply courageous work of healing. About honoring what we've lost while still choosing to live. about becoming someone new after being broken, not despite the breaking, but because of it. If you're learning English, I hope this story gave you more than vocabulary. I hope it gave you a deeper understanding of how we express the most complex human emotions in this language, how we use metaphors to make abstract feelings concrete, how we connect each moment to the next, building a narrative that mirrors life itself, how we show transformation through small details rather than grand declarations. But more importantly, if you've experienced sadness like hers, if you're currently in your own autumn wondering if spring will ever come, I hope this story told you something crucial. You are not alone. Your sadness is valid, your timeline is your own, you don't have to heal on anyone else's schedule. Slow healing is still healing. Backward steps are still part of the journey. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day you'll realize that you're breathing a little easier, that the weight has lightened, that you're still here, still capable of feeling joy alongside the sorrow. The phoenix doesn't rise from ashes all at once. It happens gradually, a feather here, a wing there, small moments of strength building into flight. You are that phoenix, you are rising even if you can't feel it yet. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for being brave enough to explore sadness both in language and in life. Thank you for still being here. Keep going, keep breathing, keep opening yourself to the possibility that life can be both heartbreaking and beautiful, both painful and meaningful, both sad and worth living. Your story isn't over, it's just transforming into its next chapter. Until we meet again, take gentle care of yourself and remember, even in your darkest autumn, spring is preparing itself beneath the ground. You are stronger than you know.